and welcome back to Franchise Focus. I'm your host, Lisa Linkowski. I am the owner of Milestone Franchising. I am a franchise consultant that matches people to the best franchise concepts out there, all at no cost to them. And Franchise Focus is all about talking with people in the franchise industry, experts in their field. So happy to have with me today Nancy Lanard with Lanard Associates. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us from outside of Plymouth Meeting, Philadelphia, right outside the Philadelphia area. And Nancy, can you please talk about some of your 25 years of how you have been in the franchising industry? You're an attorney that has specialized within franchising. Can you give us some background as to how you got your start?
Yeah, it was an interesting kind of path, actually. I graduated law school and really wasn't 100% sure the direction I wanted to take. And I was fortunate to have a wonderful in-house position with a huge conglomerate, and I worked with a group of distribution companies. It was a $3.5 billion company that I worked with, publicly traded corporation. And I worked with their group of distribution companies, and then they had a leveraged buyout of their manufacturing companies, which meant that the owners, the management, actually bought out those companies, and I ended up working with the manufacturing companies, which was great. So I got distribution, warehousing experience, and manufacturing experience from a legal end. And then I was offered a position with Nutrisystem when Nutrisystem had 1,300 franchise locations around the U.S. They were the #1 weight loss company in the United States, and they also had 500 corporate locations. So they had 1,800 locations. They had been around for 20 years. They were huge, and I was fortunate to get a position with them. And that's when I learned franchising and retail. And I worked on the leases for those 500 corporate locations. I handled franchise matters. And when they went into bankruptcy 25 years ago or so, that's when I started my first law firm. So it was an interesting path. I've had a lot of experience with different kinds of matters: manufacturing, distribution, warehousing, software licensing, but also developing franchise documents for prospective franchisors. And currently we work with franchisees and exclusively work with franchisees in helping them evaluate the franchise documents, set up their entity, help with commercial leases, and we do resales of franchise businesses as well. And we do that nationwide.
Nancy, that is a lot that you just went through. I'm going to just back it up for a moment. And Nutrisystem, that when it's that large, just so that the audience understands, that's considered like an empire. You know, it's those big behemoth franchises. What was it that brought them down?
So, that's a really interesting question, Lisa. I don't get that often, but poor management, honestly. They were super successful. Most of their not most, but a good number of their franchisees made millions. I mean, it was an incredibly successful business that had been around for 20 years. But this particular version of it, when I worked for the company, was owned by 3 men who decided to take as much money every quarter in distributions to themselves that they took money out of reserves. And when there were some tough times, and there was an allegation. It's a long story, but there was an attorney in Miami who read a very obscure medical journal that said that a liquid protein diet can cause gallbladder disease, and therefore extrapolated from that Nutrisystem, which was a 1,500 calorie, food diet, not a 500 calorie liquid diet, that Nutrisystem also caused, because it was the big target. So it was bigger than Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig. So what they said was that they alleged that Nutrisystem could cause gallbladder disease. And unfortunately, 500 lawsuits later, which is pretty hard to defend, and lots of negative publicity, as well as a Federal Trade Commission and a Federal Communications Commission and an FDA review, all were targeting Nutrisystem. And it was just very difficult. I was the attorney, actually, that was coordinating the litigation nationwide, not something I was hired to do or that I enjoyed doing per se. I literally got bins of mail, which were pleadings and other documents for the litigation, dumped in my office every day. It was crazy. But that's what brought it under. And they just didn't have the money in the reserves to battle it and to live beyond it.
Yeah,
Eventually it was bought out and became the internet-based weight loss program that you see advertised on TV currently and radio.
And, franchising is a system. So, when you hear about franchising, there's still risk. There's still risk involved because there's so many different things that can happen. We know with the pandemic that can happen. Then you just mentioned about having poor management. You can have poor franchise owners. There's various things there. But even though you went through this, and this is as bad as it gets, this is as ugly as it gets, you still stayed within franchising. And then you started your own law firm, and you now work with getting people into franchising. So that's something that where you sit there and you say, well, I wasn't so jaded and I ran the other direction. In fact, you dug in even more and said, I want to be a part of this. Talk to me about that.
I believe in the model. I really do believe in the concept of franchising. I think it's a wonderful way for people who are looking for independent business ownership to be able to achieve that. Without taking the full risk that you would have if you just started your own business. Let's say you wanted to get involved in a senior care business and you were thinking of doing it on your own. If you've never been in that world, or even if you have, starting on your own is like reinventing the wheel. As opposed to investing in a franchise opportunity, you hopefully are going to get great training. You're going to get the support that you need. You're going to have, the new innovative ways of doing things, a good franchise system. And I will say Nutrisystem had wonderful qualities to it. They constantly were creating new services and innovating with new food products, because it was food-based. So, innovating with new things and being there to assist. I was involved in, this goes back 25, 27 years ago when the food labeling laws came out, and Nutrisystem was on the forefront of labeling their products with the ingredients when that wasn't required previously. So there's a lot of things that a good franchise can do. They support with help in finding good locations. They've done good demographic studies to understand who their audience is, who the customer base is. A good franchise system has a lot to offer.
Absolutely. And I say to my candidates all the time that there are good and bad actors in every industry. I don't care what the industry is. Insurance, attorneys, whatever it is, you've got those good people that are out there and you've got those others that are not so much. And working together to understand and doing as much due diligence to see that this franchise system does have the system in place, that check, that the management is strong, check, that the ownership, because we've talked on this show about validation, that, the candidates get to call other owners and talk about the day in the life of what it's like to be this owner, check, check, check. But then there's the piece of making sure, and I just had a discussion with a candidate last night about when do you get the attorney involved? So let's talk about that, Nancy.
Usually at the point where they've narrowed down their search to the one or two that they are very seriously considering. So when they're pretty much down to almost the finish line, that would be the perfect time to be introduced to a candidate. And at that point, an introduction to me would be perfect. I respond with a link to schedule a call with me, to go on our calendar for an hour initial consultation free of charge. And then I send a link also to fill out their contact information in our client intake form, and other links to blog posts and videos that I've done on franchising that I think they would find helpful. In fact, one of the links is you mentioned about validating through talking to franchisees. One of the links that I send is a blog post that I have of my favorite top 10 questions to ask existing franchisees. And I think important for people to realize is they don't have to just be talking to franchisees that the franchisor introduced introduces them to, there is actually a full list of all franchisees and even former franchisees in every FDD, and they're there for a reason. Federal law requires that it be placed there so that a prospective franchisee can validate the system independently and call anybody they want on that list. They don't need the permission of the franchisor or even their knowledge to call anybody on that list. That's why it's there. So that disclosure document, you mentioned about the FDD, and I want to just go back a step and say that's a franchise disclosure document. And it's required of every franchise system to provide this disclosure document, or FDD, franchise disclosure document, to every prospective franchisee at least 14 calendar days before that prospective franchisee can pay any money or sign any contract. And it's there to protect that prospective franchisee. Federal law and certain state laws have that requirement so that a prospective franchisee can be informed as to what it is that they're going to be investing in. It's a really important document. It's not to be just thrown in the pile to look at some point in the future. It's really important before anybody makes that investment.
That's correct. And the FDD, as we're talking about, the franchise disclosure document, it is a lengthy document. It could be several hundred pages. One of my favorite quotes is, "It was written by attorneys for attorneys," and it's not something that the average person can look at and understand and consume and figure it all out. And that's where having an attorney that deals in franchise law, I say to my candidates, do not have your sister, brothers, uncles, cousins, divorce attorney take a look at your franchise document. You really need a franchise attorney to look at this so that they can explain it to you and they can also make recommendations to you. A lot of times, you can't make a lot of changes to that FDD document, right, Nancy? But there are some suggestions that could be made. How about that? What do you see as far as being able to kind of help your clients and saying, you know, look at some of these areas and what kind of assistance can you give in that arena?
So you touched on a couple points. One is about the FDD itself. It is a very lengthy document, but it is also very structured. It consists of 23 items of disclosure, and those 23 items, 23rd item is just the receipt that you have to sign, and it is okay to sign that receipt that just says you've received that FDD. It clocks it for the franchisor. But the other 22 items, they're required by federal law to be written in plain English. Does that mean every lawyer writes it in plain English? Probably not. And what is plain English? It's hard to say, but it's not supposed to be written in legalese. It is meant for the average person to be able to sit down and read through it and understand it. There are certain parts of it, and I go through this as part of my initial consultation with any prospective franchisee. Parts of it are more important than other parts to read through. But I do recommend reading through all 23 items. The rest of the FDD is where we get involved. And that's primarily the franchise agreement. And if someone's looking at multi-units, it's also the development agreement. Those are the actual contracts. So the FDD itself is never going to be, even in a brand new system, the FDD is a disclosure document. It's not something that can be negotiated because it's not a contract. But the franchise agreement and the development agreement, those are contracts. And in a brand new franchise where you can't validate it by talking to other franchisees because there aren't any, you're going to be one of the first 4, 5, 10, whatever in the system, we would expect there to be negotiability in those contracts, in the development agreement and in the franchise agreement. When you're talking established franchise system, like a Nutrisystem was in its day, or like a McDonald's or a Subway or Quiznos or whatever example you want to give of a very common franchise that most people know about. They're extraordinarily established, and they are not going to negotiate a single letter of that franchise agreement or the development agreement. I will say with McDonald's and some of these others that they have franchisee associations that have negotiated terms that are more favorable to a franchisee in them. So it's not as horrible as it sounds. But regardless of whether a franchise agreement is negotiable or not, it is still very, very important to have an attorney review because you don't know what you don't know. And because of that, we actually have represented many, many attorneys over the years. And, you mentioned why not use your local family law attorney, or use, the local person that's represented you for drafting up your will? Because they're not going to know what they're looking at.
That's right.
They're not going to know what's typical and not typical. And they're going to look at this and think, oh, I can just redline this document like crazy and improve it and change it. And the reality is you can't.
Right.
Not if it's an established system. And even in a brand new system, they're not going to have you redline everything. So understanding what's negotiable, what's not negotiable, understanding what's typical and not typical, and even just getting a clear understanding of the contract itself is very, very important. And it is a unique contract.
Nancy, these are all great points. We're going to have to redline right at this moment and stop for a commercial break and hear a word from our sponsors.
Okay.
Kind of new here, but I've noticed a trend. My human does this funny thing where she goes around and gets all my toys, and then she hides them in that basket by the door. But it's always the same basket, and it's always in the same place. And then she acts so surprised when I find them, but, she's putting them in the same basket again. It's like, hello, that's where you put it last time. You were the worst at hide and go seek.
Boardwalks built for fun. Legendary rock and roll clubs.
This is how we do it. Hip hop.
Casinos by the ocean.
Hip hop.
Now that's New Jersey. 130 miles of beautiful beaches. Solid rock. And everything in between.
Look in the window.
Now that's New Jersey. Plan your New Jersey trip at visitnj.org. Waves of fun. Nights of excitement. And a trail of memories. Now that's New Jersey.
And welcome back to Franchise Focus. I'm your host, Lisa Lankowski. And right before the break, I was talking with Nancy Lanard, who is the senior partner and founder of Lanard Associates. Nancy, we were in a very complicated, complex discussion about the federal disclosure document and wading through that with your clients and making sure that they understand what this important document is. It is incredibly structured, and it's one that has to be refiled every single year. And so a lot of companies had to sit there, these franchises had to put in their numbers and their information for what happened during the pandemic, and good, bad, and ugly, and indifferent, right? So it has to be done. It's just a matter of course, and it's something that protects both the franchise system as well as the candidates. So let me ask you this, just turning the tide just a little bit. What are you seeing are the trends happening in franchising? I get asked that literally every day. What are you seeing are, your clients are coming to you, and what's happening in your side of the world in franchising?
That's a great question. I just want to step back 1 second and mention, so franchise disclosure documents actually aren't filed anywhere federally.
Right.
They are,
In the
certain
state.
states do require that they be registered with those states. There's about 13 of them in the country, in the US, that require that be registered, and that registration must be renewed, excuse me, called from 3 weeks ago, sorry, must be renewed on an annual basis. And the FDD itself, that franchise disclosure document, must be updated. Federal law requires it must be updated annually, but not filed anywhere.
Correct.
But that update has to happen annually. It has to happen within 120 days of that franchisor's financial year end, known as a fiscal year end. Most are on a calendar financial year, meaning it ends December 31st. So most franchise disclosure documents are updated somewhere between January and April 30th, which is 120 days from that December 31st date. So you'll see that most FDDs are dated March and April for that reason. But there are some exceptions. If their financial or fiscal year is not a calendar year, it might be updated in a different time period. And of course, if you're in one of the states that require that FDD be registered, it's very possible that your FDD could be dated differently as well. There are specific requirements that a state's going to impose on a franchise. Sometimes addendums to the franchise agreement that the state imposes, and some states may impose risks be stated in their FDD for that state.
Excellent clarification.
Going back to your question on the trends, it's interesting that you asked that. Certainly back in the fall, before we were encouraged with vaccinations and so forth, I was seeing a lot of home-based businesses. So as opposed to those that require a location, brick and mortar, we call it. So those home-based businesses were very popular because they didn't involve having to take the risk of a lease. You basically sign the franchise agreement, go through training, and you work from your home, and you can get started pretty quickly. And the opportunity is a little different. I'm seeing a lot more actual retail or brick and mortar franchises again now. Things have picked up and starting to look a lot more normal, like they did in 2019, pre-COVID. So I'm seeing things pick up. I mean, how about you, Lisa? Are you seeing them pick up in that way as well?
I am starting to see that. It's the timing of everything is a little bit daunting sometimes for the candidates, because you've got the Small Business Administration loan, the SBA loans are still running behind quite a bit from what they used to be. Then you add in the construction period that has to come on top of that with the brick and mortar. And so you could look at a 9 to 12 month period of time if you're starting something that's completely from scratch. If you're retrofitting an existing property, then that time gets cut down. But sometimes people are so anxious to get this going right away that just seems a little further past their reach. So it's still a little bit out there, not as warm as as I'm sure it will be, and yet probably another 6 months. But one of the things that I tell candidates, not ever a better time for getting commercial real estate, and because there's been so many deals that have been given and tenant improvements that have been offered, and lease negotiation is been happening, but I'm guessing that that's going to start kind of waning as time goes on. What about you? Do you think the same thing?
Well, a couple things from what you said. So I'm seeing also an uptick in resales. So because you can then get a brick and mortar business going that it is already established. So you don't have that lag in time that you were talking about that you would have if you had to build out your own location and wait to open. So I am seeing definitely more resales, people selling right now because it's a great time to sell a franchise business, and people buying. And obviously you need both in order to have the resale. So I am seeing more of that. As far as commercial leases are concerned, yeah, I think it's a phenomenal time. And I think there's two parts to that. There's the part that is the business negotiation, the business terms that are negotiated typically by the local realtor. So those would be things like the rent, the square footage, the tenant improvement allowance that you talked about, or maybe the landlord will even do some of the build out work, and negotiating those kinds of things, and the maintenance responsibilities, renewal term, and all of those kinds of things. Usually the local realtor who's familiar with whatever the fair market rental value is at the time for that location and familiar with what's going on locally. They'll negotiate all of those. It gets memorialized in what's called a letter of intent, or known as an LOI. That letter of intent is, and once that has been agreed upon, then it's presented. Usually the landlord presents that to the landlord's attorney, who then draws up the lease. So that letter of intent might be a 3 to 5 page document that memorializes those business terms, and it becomes that 30 to 80 page lease that is, the actual contract that a tenant franchisee that is going to be living under. I don't think people realize how important everything else is in that lease. They think that if they've gotten great business terms, that's all they need to worry about. But the reality is we get involved in everything else. So can you imagine, Lisa, if you had a retail business, let's say you had a, name one of the franchises that you work with.
So a massage place.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, let's take a massage business, and you're in a shopping center, and your lease allows the landlord, which most landlords have in their commercial leases from the start because they want this flexibility, the ability to relocate you at any time, as many times as they want, anywhere in the shopping center. What happens? What happens to your business? Number one, how long are you going to be closed when they're relocating you? Who pays for the new build out? What happens, if they move you to a place that no one can find you anymore? You're like in the back of the shopping center and they can't find you anymore. They can't see you and they can't find you. You've just lost your business because of one clause in the lease. That's how important a commercial lease is. Well, and I think people fail to realize how critical it is. And that's not even talking about everything else. I mean, personal guarantees. Chances are any particular franchisee / tenant is going to have to personally guarantee, the lease. You certainly don't want to be personally guaranteeing it for a full 10 years, because if you default after year 2 or 3, you're going to be paying 7 or 8 years of rent. That could be millions of dollars. On top of which, what happens when you sell the business? Are you able to assign that lease to someone buying it without too many conditions or costs? And what happens to that personal guarantee? Are you actually released from it if you sell the business? There's so many important clauses in a commercial lease. I actually wrote an article that was published in the American Bar Association's franchise journal called The Franchise Lawyer that was specifically on 10 issues. It was written for other lawyers, of course, but 10 issues that any attorney representing a franchisee / tenant should be concerned about. It's very, very critical, very important, and very it doesn't get the attention that it should get. Let's put it that way.
Well, if anyone is not convinced that they need someone like Nancy for representing them for franchise representation or for commercial lease, Nancy has just given a wealth of information to us today. And Nancy, I can't thank you enough. Let me ask you this: has your law firm won any recent awards lately?
Thank you for asking that. We actually have. We were named by U.S. News and World Report as a best law firm for franchise law. I also was given an award individually as an attorney by U.S. News and World Report as best lawyer. Franchise Times, which is a leading publication in the franchise world, has named me Legal Eagle for the last, 13, 14 years consecutively. Yeah, we've definitely gotten some accolades, and it's been really wonderful.
Well, congratulations to you on that. And Nancy, what is the best way for our audience to reach you?
I'm going to put that up on the screen so that you can see that. It has some of the information.
Excellent.
But basically, go to our website, which is www.lanardandassociates.com. And Lanard and Associates is spelled with all A's. So, and is spelled out, similar to my email there. So my phone number and my email are there. I welcome you to call or email me anytime, and I look forward to that opportunity.
Nancy, we can't thank you enough for joining us today. We have learned so much. I'm going to have you back because I think we just scratched 1/10 of the surface of all the things that we could have discussed today. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for watching Franchise Focus. And please stay tuned to watch every Friday at 1 o'clock. Lisa Lankowski, owner of Milestone Franchising, and you can find more out about my company at milestonefranchising.com.